Every Saturday during the Sabbath prayers, Orthodox Jews recite a prayer, a liturgy. And it's an incredibly beautiful prayer, powerful, exalting God, His majesty, His glory, and so on. It's a wonderful prayer. However, it was actually written by a Christian, a very famous Christian, and most Orthodox Jews do not know this. And the ones that do know it try to use all kinds of rhetoric to dismiss why that would be important at all. Now, this is not actually from Christian scholars saying this. This is actually Jewish writings that claim that it's from a Christian source, but there's a specific methodology they use to dismiss it, and I will get into that. So what is this prayer? What is the legend behind it? How did it come to be? And how do we know it's actually a Christian prayer? Well, the prayer is called Nishmat Kol Chai. It's a prayer exalting God. It's a wonderful liturgy. It's incredibly scriptural in its nature. And you might say, well, if it's incredibly scriptural, that could be Jewish or Christian, but I will explain why it's uniquely Christian in its style. And the legend goes, the Jewish legend, is that Simon Peter, Peter the Apostle, was commissioned by the rabbis to infiltrate early Christianity, to make changes, to separate them and make them distinct so that Jews would know not to follow early Christianity, because many Jews were joining Christianity. And that this prayer was actually written by Peter the Apostle as an answer to the rabbis to let them know that he was still totally faithful to God and the God of Israel and the Jewish people, and that he was not becoming a genuine Christian. That's the legend. And there's certain elements within the prayer that point to somebody named Shimon writing it, which is the Hebrew name for Simon Peter. And it is a Jewish story about the Apostle Peter writing this prayer. Now, the legend itself was kind of concocted in a certain way as a polemic against Christianity, and that's a medieval legend that we're citing here. However, the prayer itself actually goes back to around the 1st century. It actually is from that time period, very likely written by Simon Peter or somebody in that group around that time. And the Jewish legend pointing to it would give indication that it could perhaps have actually been written by Peter. But they want to cite it as a way to prove that Peter was actually not a genuine Christian, that he was actually at odds with Paul and made all these separations on purpose to separate the Jews from the Christians. Now, there's a lot of problems with that part of the story. Rightly pointed out, there's a certain website where people ask Jewish questions and rabbis answer and so on. Somebody wrote in asking about this, and the rabbi actually gives a pretty clear story about what actually happened there, and tries to dismiss it as unimportant, but actually points to various sources that validate this claim. So the one who really denies the whole story entirely is Rashi. Now, Rashi is a 11th century rabbi. I think I'm getting that right, 11th century. And he's known as one of the few rabbis in history that is very, very focused on anti-Christian polemics. Now, Rashi writes that if somebody attributes this prayer, this beautiful liturgy, to Peter the Apostle, they are actually guilty and have to bring a sin offering when the temple is restored. That's a really intense reaction, because there's no reason why you would bring a sin offering for making a claim like that. Rashi's intense, visceral response to this claim as an anti-Christian polemicist kind of demonstrates how there is some truth there, that the prayer might actually be a Christian prayer, and he does not want people to admit that. And then other later sources actually cite Rashi's grandson as disagreeing with him, admitting that it is a Christian prayer written by Peter, but that Peter was really righteous. And another rabbi from around the same time, Yehuda HaChassid, a very famous rabbi, actually says that it absolutely was from Peter, but he was totally righteous, and he was, and other people following him made errors, but he was actually righteous, and so the prayer is still good and kosher, as it were. Now, there's a lot of problems in the story. First of all, the fact is that Peter was actually not the one making major changes to how people followed the law. That was actually Paul. So the idea of trying to undermine this prayer the idea of trying to undermine Peter's role in the prayer, saying that it is a good prayer, but he was actually trying to warp Christianity on purpose, that falls apart completely, because it is not Peter that's doing that. it's Paul and some later figures. Not that it's warped, but that it's the changes that are made about following the law are from Paul's writings, not from Peter. Peter is actually the one opposing that in some way and trying to keep early Christians following the laws and circumcision and so on. So the idea that Peter was genuinely Jewish and was trying to subvert Christianity, that actually falls apart. So the whole story seems to be true in the perspective that it actually is a Christian prayer written by Peter, but the rest of it about how he was trying to undermine Christianity seems to be very clearly a polemic against Christianity. So it falls apart completely. And the rabbi who's writing this article in response, he gives his kind of take on why it may not be a true legend at all, but then at the very end he goes, well, even if it's true, it doesn't really matter because it's an accepted prayer, and so too late, we do it, and we can just ignore the fact that it's a Christian prayer. But he's essentially saying throughout the whole response, there are sources that back up that this is a prayer written by Peter, Jewish sources. And all their whole claim to why it's okay is that it's not that Peter didn't write it and it's really a Jewish prayer. Their claim is that Peter did write it and Peter wasn't really a Christian, which is an absurd claim. So it stands to reason that Peter actually did write it, and it is a Christian prayer, and it was adopted by Jews because a lot of early Christianity was adopted by Jews. Not only that, a lot of early Christianity is Jewish in its nature, and so it obviously continued in Jewish circles as well as in Christian circles. There's a lot of things that are crossovers because they are both based in the Hebrew Scriptures. So there's obviously going to be crossovers there. Now, one might respond to this and say, well, there are other prayers that kind of sound like this. How do we know that this one is Christian? Well, aside from the legend about it being from an early Christian, a Jewish legend about it, it differs from the vast majority of Jewish liturgy in very significant ways. If you look at it related to things like the Amidah prayer, the Shemona Esrei, where the culmination of the tefillah, the prayer service, that's very formulaic, whereas Nishmat Kol Chai is more of a liturgy in kind of an exalting sense. I think the word is doxological. It's more of an exalting prayer. Other Jewish prayers during the service that are exalting in nature are simply reading scriptures. It's not a composed prayer. It's reading the Psalms and things like that. So that would differ from those in that way. And then the other composed prayers that are similar, things like Aleinu, those are pre-rabbinic. In all likelihood, they're pre-rabbinic. So it wouldn't be like a rabbinic composed prayer that's similar to Nishmat Kol Chai. That's a little bit different there. And then in the Aleinu prayer, there's actually specific reference to God separating the Jewish people from the rest of the nations. It's very ethnocentric in that way. So that also differs from the Nishmat Kol Chai prayer. The exalting nature as a composed prayer that does not refer specifically to Israel uniquely separate from the rest of creation. It's a prayer of all creation exalting God. This is very unique in Jewish liturgy, and it actually points to it being much more likely a Christian prayer composed by either Peter or somebody else in his circle, because there's no Christian legend about it being from Peter. It could very well have been somebody else from the early Christian circle, the early Jewish followers of Jesus. And then that's why the rabbis are attributing it to Peter, is because they don't know exactly who it's from, but it's obviously from somebody in that circle at that time period. So Orthodox Jews are almost 100% reciting a Christian prayer every single Saturday on the Sabbath and during other holiday liturgies and so on. It's a powerful and beautiful liturgical prayer, and it is very, very likely written by an early Christian and adopted into Orthodox Judaism, recited by Orthodox Jews all the time. So this is an incredibly interesting phenomenon in the Jewish world. Jews very much, we tend to separate from Christianity very strongly. The fact that there is a Christian liturgy, or at least something that is more reminiscent of Christianity and presented by a Christian in the Jewish prayer service, interesting phenomenon, and very provocative to provide food for thought and to think about the implications of that.